All right, it's 5:30 in the morning and I just had this really funky dream. And as we all know, dreams aren't reality. They're considered fiction. But I just had to talk about it in a video because it was so vivid and it played out in stages. And whenever I have a dream like that, it always gets my attention. Because oftentimes later on, elements of that dream seem to apply to real life. So here we go. The Democratic candidates were having their debate, but they were debating about the Bible and religion. And one of them, I don't rightly remember which one, was saying how glad they were that they wrote certain parts of the Bible so that they could plant the seeds of deception and get the human race to fall into their hands or their control. And they went on and on about how there was some truth and some mistruth, some misquotes and misstatements to put everything in a certain light. And that's why, according to them, the New Testament was written. Because the Old Testament was too stringent, was too black and white, was too positive or negative. You either toed the mark or paid the price. That was the Old Testament. And according to them, and this is what they were debating about, that's why the New Testament was written and structured in such a way so that humanity could be more easily controlled. Something I have actually touched on in more than one video. If you're constantly turning the other cheek, what happens? You end up with red cheeks because people have to be held accountable for the things that they do instead of just unconditionally forgiven. That was basically the gist of stage one of this dream. So now we'll move on to stage two. I was in the Attorney General's office of the United States, of all places, listening to the people who work in the Justice Department talk about everything that has been going on around the Trump administration. The legal FISA warrants, the spying, the uranium one came up, the kickbacks from Ukraine and so forth and so on. And they were talking about how it was such a big scandal that they didn't know how to handle it all. And that the American public would be so shocked and so thrown off kilter because of everything that was involved, they were afraid to even touch it. And somehow or another, I got to participate in the conversation. And my point was that the American people, or the world for that fact, because this is a worldwide problem, will be forever in chains or enslaved to these people if it isn't all bought out. And before that stage ended, the general consensus of everybody in that part of the dream was, yeah, you're right. This can't go on. It's unjust, and the American people are going to have to deal with it. And that's just the way it is. Because they would be remiss in their duties and their oaths to their office and to the Constitution if they didn't follow through with it all. That's basically the Reader's Digest condensed version of stage two, because it was a lot more detailed than that. They basically ran down the entire scandal, saying several times throughout the conversation that this is the biggest scandal in American history. So now we'll move on to stage three, which is the most bizarre part of the dream because it didn't really make sense until I woke up and thought about it for a little bit. Stage three of the dream. I found myself in China, listening to the higher ups in the Chinese government talking about the scandal that's about to break in the US and how they had to come up with something to distract and or control their people when it finally came out because they were so heavily involved. And several ideas were floated and this and that, and yeah, they spoke English in the dream, so whatever. And somebody came up with a bright idea to turn up the 5G to the maximum level or whatever it would take to make people sick and have it appear that there was some kind of epidemic going on. So they could go around and gather up the questionable people and have them contained, confined, or just plain eliminated when everything finally came out. Because they were afraid that the rest of the world would wake up to what has been going on for centuries when everything in the US came out, particularly in China, because they were so heavily involved in what they wanted the end game to be. Ultimately, a new system installed, the United States overthrown, and their system being the model here so that they could expand their territories, expand their claims in the US, and basically expand their country and their influence. And the Chinese leaders seemed really concerned about what their people might think should it all come out into public knowledge of how intricate the plan really was, what the end game was, what the consequences for the rest of the world were, and so forth and so on. And that's why they had to come up with this plan to pacify their people and distract them from what's really going on so that they could hold and maintain their power. And the last part of it was watching the Chinese government implement their hoax, poisoning their people with 5G radiation so that they would come down with symptoms that mimic the flu. And the closer you were to wherever the central hub of the system was, the more sick or the more symptoms that you showed. And some people actually, at least was in the dream, did die, did fall over in the streets and so forth and so on, just like we've been witnessing. And that's when I woke up. And I sat here for a little while thinking about it. And it all kinds of makes sense, even though it's a dream. Smoke and mirrors and the art of deception has been going on longer than all of us have been alive. And the biggest fear the powers that be throughout the world would have is it all being exposed. And there's so much at stake. Those people who would ultimately pay the price, lose power, go to jail, what have you, would basically do anything to avoid it. And because the game has always been deception, distraction, smoke and mirrors, as they say, that's always their go to strategy. So again, it was just a dream, but it was so real and so vivid. And everything made so much sense, falling in line like pieces of a puzzle during the dream, that when I woke up and thought about it, it made even more sense. So I'll close it out like this. We should all keep our eye on the ball and keep grabbing for the brass ring of truth, disclosure, and accountability. Because deception is the name of the game. And anyone who's been paying attention should have figured that out by now. And everything is suspect if we're not willing to demand for truth, disclosure, and accountability.